The Bookshelf with Ryan Tubridy is brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. Eason have a rich heritage of bookselling since 1886. In fact, it's probably where you got your first ever book, or maybe your last one, and hopefully your next one after you listen to this episode of our podcast. And stay listening for our Ryan Recommends slot, my weekly recommendation, where I'll discuss a book I've read recently that I think you'll really enjoy too. All the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or indeed order online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired. Our guest today is one of the most prolific and successful writers working in the UK and I'd say the world. He is unique for working across so many media. He's a born polymath. He juggles writing, books with TV series and films and plays and journalism and much more besides. With over 50 books, including the best-selling Alex Rider series, he's sold over 21 million copies worldwide. His novels extend to adult fiction with notable works like the award-winning Magpie Murders, which I talk about a lot and with good reason, and continuation novels for two of the world's most iconic characters, two of my favourites, Sherlock Holmes and James Bond, into whose characters he's infused life and a cheekiness that is so becoming of both characters. And indeed, our guest today, he is also celebrated for creating and writing some of the UK's most beloved and successful TV series, Midsomer Murders there, Foyle's War, Moonflower Murders, based on his novel, finished filming last year. To top it all off, he was awarded a CBE in 2022 for his contributions to literature. Surely there's more to come. I am delighted to welcome one of my all-time favourite authors, Anthony Horowitz, to the Bookshelf. Welcome, Anthony.
Hello, Ryan. What a pleasure to be talking to you again.
I always love seeing you because you have an evangelical love of reading that I think we share, but it's not just passion, it's fervour. It's religious.
It has been my entire life. I mean, I'm not sure I intended it to be, but from the age of 10, I think, I've been immersed in books one way and another, making up stories and reading stories and telling stories and writing, of course, stories.
But you also, not only do you love writing tremendous stories for people, you love getting people to read. I think anything, not just your own stuff.
Well, I have observed in my long life that people who read are generally more interesting and happier and more fulfilled than people who don't, and that especially amongst young people, I have become something of a crusader for sort of libraries in schools in particular. Yes. There is a shocking series of statistics that show how many schools in the United Kingdom just do not have libraries, not often because they don't have the money, but because they don't have the space. And so all my life, I now find myself going on about the fact that reading should be an essential part of the curriculum, that schools that don't have libraries and incidentally are fully employed and qualified librarians are missing something. They're missing the beating heart, the thing that connects every single department in the school. It doesn't matter what you want to do as a young person, whether it's going to be sort of football or art or drama or brain science or whatever, brain surgery.
Yes.
You will find something in the library that will steer you down the road you wish to go. Yeah. And so it seems crazy to me that so many schools in this country are under-resourced in that way.
The other point, of course, about reading is that for people who are listening and going, well, it seems to be for other people, the way some people think opera or ballet belong to others. Reading is arguably the most democratic, accessible
demographic,
form.
I think is what you're looking for, but in demographics, it is the great equalizer. But anybody, anywhere can afford a book. I mean, you can buy a book second hand for less than the price probably of a bar of Cadbury's, but you could also go to libraries in the high street and you could read for free. Books should be accessible to everybody, and if you are in a place in your life where you are having difficulties, where you're underprivileged, where you cannot afford to go, I don't know, to the other side of the world on a jet or whatever, a book gives you something of that. Gives you more than that. It gives you all of that pleasure. It opens the doors into extraordinary lands. That's how my entire life began, because I was an unhappy kid stuck at a horrible school. It was the library and reading books that opened doors. And you may have heard me say this before, but a book is the same shape as a door. It has the same proportions as a door, and it opens like a door. That's no accident, because books for me at that age were a doorway out of the sort of the misery of a rich, privileged, but rather fat and stupid kid into a world of travel, adventure, romance, excitement, good food, happiness.
Now I'm going to go through the door. Our first book today is, of course, the book from your childhood. You describe what did you call yourself? chubby but useless?
Well, I was rotund, and I was also led to believe by my teachers at the particularly vile school where I happened to find myself aged 8. You know that in England anyway, our parents paid an awful lot of money to make sure we were completely screwed up before we were 13, and my parents were no exception to that rule and sent me to a place in North London where I was dreadfully unhappy until I discovered the library and my first book.
Give us a sense of the unhappiness in terms of what was happening that was so awful.
It was being friendless. It was being beaten by a headmaster who beat you till you bled. It was teachers who were, I think, probably war damaged. PTSE, is it? And who were taking it out on the kids. It was an atmosphere of brutality and perverted sexuality, and it was a daily grind. I was very innocent. I didn't really have a full understanding of what was happening around me. All I knew was that I hated being there every minute of the day. And I still remember that when it was time to go back to school at the end of each holidays, I would go into a sort of hysteria. I would try and diet to lose weight because I knew I was going to get bullied and teased. I would be sobbing and hiding and just counting the minutes until the car would come and take me. It was only about 8 or 9 miles away from where I lived, but it felt like the other side of the planet. And then once again, I was sort of, it was the food there was so disgusting. I've just actually read a memoir by Earl Spencer, Charles Spencer, who's written a book about his time at his prep school, and it was an extremely difficult, triggering read because so much of what he wrote I had experienced as well, even down to the fact, curiously, that we had the same locker number at not at the same schools. We were years and miles apart, but nonetheless, it just brought back to me how many men there are of about my age who went through this torment in the name of what exactly? I suppose my parents hoped it would make a better person of me, maybe a better Englishman than I was, coming from a Jewish middle-class family. Yeah. It's one of the strange mysteries of life that I was never able to ask my father, who died quite young, or my mother, why? I mean, I have 2 sons, and I wouldn't have sent them to a school like that. And if they'd been as unhappy as I was, I'd have pulled them out in an instant.
Isn't it extraordinary? It was the done thing. What was the food?
Well, the food is, again, in the book I just read, he ate the same food as me. One of them was porridge. I just remember that. You see, you're an 8-year-old, a bit of a, fragile flower. You haven't really experienced much in life outside your wealthy house. And incidentally, I know people listening to this might be saying, why is he complaining, rich parents and all that? And I always have the answer, which is that rich kids can be unhappy too, of course. But anyway, I entered this environment where this plate of porridge, I just remember it on the first day it was put in front of me. And it was like eating, I don't know, polyfiller in sour milk. It was utterly disgusting. And then this woman comes to me and says, you've got to eat every single thing in that plate. Everything you were given in this room, you will eat. And so I'm having to sort of force this slop into my mouth. Now when my wife and my children eat porridge around me, I still feel nauseous. And there was also the other thing, which was liver. I'll never forget, we used to have liver once a week. And that liver, you would cut it through and there'd be a bit where your knife could not cut because the white vein inside that liver was still there and still so disgusting. Again, you had to wolf it down somehow and sort of, without throwing up. So, but again, it's wrong perhaps to complain about bad food in a world in which many young people aren't getting any food at all. But at that time, as that 8-year-old, food is something I do remember from the school. But that was a tiny, tiny part of the sort of the brutality, the violence. And as I say, I know of other boys in that school who were also sexually abused as well as physically abused as I was. I was not sexually abused, but it was all around me. And again, the whole idea of throwing 8 to 13-year-olds with all that testosterone, with all that growing up to do into that very peculiar male-only environment is in itself unnatural and wrong. Yeah. And I look back on my life with the knowledge that this has been a great part of the fuel of my writing, the sort of the anger of a lost childhood, the sort of sense of self-worthlessness, lack of self-confidence, and a sort of a general tendency to be depressed. All of that started in that place. I've never really shaken it off.
God, and the vividness of the picture you paint suggests an etching in the soul.
Well, I remember going back to the school just once. A Dutch film crew took me there for some reason I cannot remember. And I remember going into the school, and the school is now very modern and new and clean, but there is one part of it they keep exactly as it was. I think is a sort of a historical testament to the fact that the school is established and has been around a long time. And I remember that as I passed my locker and then past the headmaster's study, I began to feel ill. And when I went into the dining room of this place, where I had eaten all those years ago and was meant to be giving a speech there, something happened to me. And you know me well, Ryan. You know I'm not a particularly emotional person. I don't sort of, go out there with sort of fainting fits. But in this hall, I found my palms were sweating, the room was spinning, I thought I was going to be sick, my vision blurred, and at that moment I realised I'd been making jokes about this school all my life. Gruesome Grange 1 and 2, The Switch, all those early children's books of mine are all about sort of rich, unhappy kid in a ghastly school, and I'd made jokes about it, but it was only when I had this near fainting fit where I nearly did pass out that I realised actually, it's done you damage, and it's still there, and you have managed to sort of quash it all, but it is still hurting you. And friends of mine have said, why haven't you gone to a therapist? Why haven't you actually, you are my therapist today, so I'm getting it for free, which is quite helpful sort of development. But the reason I never did go to therapists was I always felt that unhappiness was fueling my writing, but I was writing, if you like, to sort of burn the metal, the memory, the unpleasantness of it all was the flame that was getting my writing bubbling away.
Your writing was your therapy, in a manner of speaking.
Sort of, yes. I thought if I actually sort myself out to become a completely healthy, happy person, maybe I won't want to write so much.
Or you write boring books.
My books will have less of an edge to them. So I've always just sort of lived with it because I think it is. Once somebody once asked me, would I have swapped a completely happy childhood for a writing career? So in other words, had no writing career, but have had a happy childhood. And I think the answer actually is broadly, I'm sort of would probably stick with what I've got, because at least I have done something useful with it. When I hear that my Alex Rider books or my books for young people have helped and that a generation has grown up reading them, and I've just come back from a literary festival in Dubai where I met sort of 30-year-olds who were so excited to meet me because I had helped them through their early teenage years or been part of their life, a molecule but still there. I just think to myself, well, that was worth doing. That's a life worth living. And so I think I would stick with what hand I was dealt. And I'm not, as I say, complaining to you. That is just how it was, and that is where we are.
Let's go to the 8-year-old Anthony Horowitz in the school. He's just had a bowl of porridge that he did not want. He's just probably got a punch in the head from somebody that shouldn't have done it, and you're really unhappy. I want to see you looking at that book that you saw that changed everything, or at least that moment where you thought, herein lies escape.
Okay, so you go past the headmaster's study where you get beaten regularly.
Yes.
You go past locker number 64, which is on the bottom, and it's got a little wooden door and the number and a little metal pull. And you pass a couple of classrooms. On the right, Mr. Priestman's classroom. He was a maths teacher, horrible man. And then you come to a corridor, turn left, and there is a door that goes into the library. It has wooden panels. It doesn't have that many books in it, but it is a small, square space. And in it are books that I begin to read. And one of the very first books I pull out on a shelf is not even really a book at all. Because don't forget, I'm not a clever kid. I'm not saying I was an angel or brilliant or misunderstood. I was just an ordinary kid. And I wasn't reading a great deal. I mean, Valiant comics and sort of those old Second World War comics that was still very much in the thing there. Eat that, Jerry. Caption. So there is a comic book, or what we would call a comic book, although in its current country of origin, it has a much grander title of a bande dessinée, or these days you would call it, I suppose, a graphic novel.
Yes.
And what it is a Tintin book. And I pick it up and I start to thumb through it. And it's like nothing I've ever really come across, because it's full of these, first of all, it's full of absolutely wonderful pictures. And I'm talking about a book which is a great work of art. I mean, Hergé is the father of the modern graphic novel. He was the first person, incidentally, who brought down the words that people spoke and took them off the bottom. They used to run across the bottom of a picture before him. He put them into balloons and put them into people's mouths. So that was one small thing he did. But what he also did was he was a beautiful draftsman. And he created this whole family of extraordinary, funny, larger-than-life, colourful, silly, but instantly memorable and recognizable characters. Yes. And he put them into an extraordinary array of remarkable adventures. And the one that I had picked up that day was called The Seven Crystal Balls, which is not the choice of book that I have today, but it's actually one of the there are only two, I think, others that are double adventures. So you start in one book and you finish. The second half of it is The Prisoners of the Sun. And to this day, it remains the greatest inspiration of my life. It is the book that took me out of the school. It took me into Machu Picchu, into South America, into a crazy, zany world of happenstance and coincidence and twists and turns and humor, and introduced me to this great family of characters. And if you were to come to my office in London, you will find Hergé mementos everywhere I look, because in the darkness of the world we live in and of my own life, these are still the pinpricks of light that just make me smile.
Give us an example of something you own that you look at and you get that light from.
Well, I mean,
if you look around your desk,
yes, I have. I obviously have a Tintin rocket, Destination Moon One. If you're a Tintinophile, you have to have the rocket, of course. And then I've got a couple of posters, except they're not posters; they're lithographs. One of which was signed by Hergé. And I remember I was shooting a TV program in Lyon, in France, which is a very, very long time ago. And when I arrived, they gave me my per diems for the whole 2 months I was going to be there, 8 weeks of per diems, which was quite a chunk of money at that time. This is, 30 odd years ago. And I left the office and went down the street. And as I went down the street, I passed a shop. And in the shop was this lithograph by Hergé, signed by him. And what it is, it's all the characters in Tintin, and it's a design for a mosaic that was put into a town hall, I think, in Brussels, on the wall. And he had done designs for it. And at the grand opening, when this mosaic was finally unveiled, it was these were given out to the people who came in a program. Yes, and so I got, and the cost of it was exactly the same as all the per diems I had for 8 weeks. So
you blew it in one go.
I scrounged food and ate cheaply and bought this thing. And I still have that in my office, and it sits there as well on the wall near my desk. And then, I've got all the books obviously are in the shelves there in various languages. I've read them both in English and in French. I even have a couple in Greek, which I quite like. And little other bits and pieces here and there, because the Hergé estate have done their merchandising very, very cleverly. It's very hard to find anything that is tat. Everything you buy is
very
quite
tasteful.
Pricey, but very, very well made and well done. All my life, I have had a connection to Tintin, and he even worked on the Tintin film. I don't know if you know this,
but a fine film.
Steven Spielberg made the film of what was it now? I can't even remember which one it was that he made. But anyway, I worked on that script, and
I didn't know that.
So you're got immersed in it. In fact, the funny thing about my childhood reading is that every single book I loved as a child, and that includes sort of the big three really, Tintin, Bond, and Sherlock Holmes. You mentioned two of them in your introduction. Yes. I have come to work on in my old age, and that is, of course, the thing about reading when you were young, which is that you the books you read sort of from 8 to 13 do have a habit of staying with you for life. They never quite leave your bloodstream, and they sort of colour a little bit who you are, which is another reason why reading is such a sort of a vital part of the colour of life. I think life without reading is sort of a bit black and white.
That is the book of your the childhood book that you've chosen for us. I just think it's a great
choice. This is the
first
book I can honestly say I loved. It led to others. I mean, there are many, many writers that I read starting at around about the age of 10, 11, 12, and I became a sort of a bibliophile into my teens. But I compare Hergé in a strange way to my other great love in life, and that's Charles Dickens. And you may say, but hold on a minute, Dickens is, the greatest 19th century novelist who ever lived, and Hergé wrote cartoons. But where I think the similarity is that they both created not just books, but worlds. But it's true of Conan Doyle as well, incidentally.
Yes.
That, the world of Dickens, the world of Doyle, the world of Hergé is more than a book. It is where the characters and the architecture and the sense of it, the smell of it, the look of it all come together and suck you in, and you are no longer in this world.
Yeah, and that's where you wanted to be. Yes. Any other world other than this one.
Well, at that time, yes.
And at that time you got there. Crikey. I feel like I've just been on a Tintin adventure myself.
I'm happy for you.
I'm reminded at the back of the book there that you brought in, because I had a small collection of them at home, not as extensive as yours, no doubt, but at the very back of the cover, you're able to look at the ones you had and the ones you wanted, and the Tintin ones you wanted to borrow from the library, all the like the back of the Mr. Men did the same thing. I wish I had that one. Wish I had that one. It's a nice little touch.
It is so true, Ryan. I remember as a boy when I was
that?
collecting things, I'm going to get that one.
That's it. That's
one.
next. Yeah, that's exciting.
And they just look lovely together as well.
Let's move to our second book now that made you cry, actually, because I think that this is a book that is always going to be tricky because either you are one of two things. You've got too much choice or you've little or no choice. I don't know where you are, and that we'll come to that in a moment. But before I do that, I have to ask you about your propensity to cry or lack of propensity to cry. Where are you in the crying scheme of things?
I think the best or the worst I get to is my eyes water and I feel sad. I don't actually ever cry
Yes.
with
sob.
tears or sob when I'm reading or watching television or films. I feel an immense sense of sadness, but it's a sadness which I rather like because, of course, that is the sadness that the author was attempting to transmit to you. So you don't read a sad story and are shocked and surprised, as in, for example, the death of a friend or a relative or even a pet or whatever. Where the sudden shock of it might actually make you cry, and I think I did burst into tears when my last dog got put down. But so because of the artistry of grief in a book, because of the genius of the writer, part of me is feeling the sadness that is wanted, but another part of me is admiring the cleverness of what he has done.
I see. So you're moved.
I'm definitely moved.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I nearly brought in Kazuo Ishiguro's book, Never Let Me Go, which is a book which is just one of the saddest, most endlessly painful and awful books. And in some respects, it does have something in common beyond the sadness with the book I have chosen. But it's
funny enough, it's Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go. When people say to me, "What's the one that makes you cry?" That's the one I would have picked of all the books
of
in all the
yours.
world.
Really?
I'm so happy you mentioned
did you cry?
it. Yeah, I did. But I cried in the sense that you. More like you. There's a moistening of the eye. There isn't tears rolling down the face. It's a bit different.
There is enough real grief in the world, and I think tears.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that people who cry at operas or when they're watching a film or TV are in any way. I'm not dissing them. I mean, and I can perfectly understand people who react that way. But my feeling is actually that there is enough awfulness in the world for real tears, and that actually there is something. For me, anyway, a little bit too, I don't know, ephemeral, a little bit too ephemeral, not ephemeral, what's what I'm looking for? It's just to cry at a book seems a little bit too indulgent for me.
Okay, a little performative maybe, I don't know.
Performative, that might be
possibly
the word.
it.
Yes. But that is to not knock people who come on your podcast in future editions and say they blub like crazy when, for example, they read My Last Alex Rider or whatever.
If the book takes you there, it takes you. Yeah. Right then, Anthony, let's talk about the book that moved you to eye moistening.
Definitely. Well, this book has stayed with me all my life. I read it in my I think I was about 21 or 2 maybe when I read it. And it's a book that has been on the syllabus at times, and certainly was when I was a boy. It's Thomas Hardy, the Mayor of Casterbridge.
Oh, very good.
What is it about this book that does it for me? It is a journey of such the journey of Michael Henchard. I should quickly outline the plot for those who don't know. Michael Henchard is first met as a very young man. He's a hay farmer of sorts, and he gets drunk in a pub, and he gets into a discussion with somebody, which turns into an auction in which he sells his wife and his child, his daughter. And apparently Hardy based this on a real incident that had happened. The book was written, I think, in the mid-19th century. We then cut forward, 18 years, where he has now reformed himself. He's never drunk again. He's become a teetotal man, and he has risen, he's a successful corn factor in the town of Casterbridge, and he's also the mayor. And his whole history and his terrible incident, he had tried incident. He has found his wife. His wife has come back to him, and his wife and his daughter are now reunited with him, but they are all living with this terrible secret. And from that moment onwards, where we rejoin them in 18 years later, everything that can go wrong in this man's life goes wrong. And it is a rapid descent, a spiral back into drinking, back into destitution, back into horrendous unhappiness and failure in which he loses everything. And one of the things about the book which always made an impression upon me was how cruel the author is. And that actually comes back to your question about why don't I actually cry? And that's because Hardy really throws everything he can at this character. And the subheading of the title is it's the life and death of a man of character. And I think that's a really, really interesting secondary title for this very, very well-known book, because that is what Henchard is. He's not a good man, not an entirely bad man, but he is certainly a man of character. And does he deserve what happened to him? I'll give you one moment in this book which always stays with me, and I think it's terribly sad. His daughter gets married, and because he has rowed with the man who is marrying her, he is not invited to the wedding. Or he does go to it, but he doesn't go into the church. And he just quietly leaves them a little present, which is a couple of songbirds in a cage as their wedding present. And nobody notices the cage until it's too late, and those two birds die.
Oh, come on.
And there, in that moment of pathos, is just the whole book. I mean, Henchard himself does not have a happy ending. I mean, I've given you the subheading, so I can say that he himself is not going to live beyond the last page. But his own, he is as well a sort of, he's not a songbird trapped in a cage, but he is trapped by fate, circumstance, and his own character and personality. And I think that the book is totally, or almost totally, unforgiving. And that also makes it a very painful and sad read. It's also, of course, beautifully written. Nobody quite captured that century and rustic life and the farmer's life better than Hardy. And this book I've read it twice in my life. It's another interesting, for me anyway, thing that, you read a book when you are in your 20s, you read it again when you are in your 60s.
Different man.
And it's very interesting to see how those books, how your reactions to those books change. I think actually it is a definition of great literature.
Yes.
That when you read it twice or three times in your life, it's a different book.
I was going to ask you, did you read two different books then, obviously?
No, I read the same book, I think, but my reaction to it, obviously, the older I was, the more upset I was by it. I think maybe I was more sort of serves him right when I was young, and now as an older man, I see to myself, well, actually, he did try to improve. He did try to make penance for what he had done, and it just didn't work out.
And what do you think? I'm trying to get to the rub here, in the sense that what element within the book, because that was a school book for me, and the joy of it was just killed in the classroom, dead. So for you, what's in the book that makes you go, oh God, I find that very moving, or I find that I'm close to tears thinking about this? Was it the injustice, the cruelty? Was it the awful lotto numbers in life he got, or was it the songbirds?
I think it was the inevitability of it. I think that's the great thing about books and reading, is that, when you start a book, it takes you somewhere with a sort of an inevitability about it. I mean, I think, a book satisfies you when the ending is sort of seeded in the very first words of the book. I remember that back when I was working in movies in the sort of 80s and 90s, Hollywood would test films. If they would make a film, they would shoot it and film it, and then they would show it to a group of people. And if the people didn't like the ending, they would just simply reshoot another ending. So if the hero's killed and everyone says they don't like that, the hero magically survives. Yeah. And I always used to think that was actually very anti-story. That was actually against the whole ethos of what fiction and good writing is, which is that the end is found in the beginning is the end. In the end is the beginning. If I may misquote, I think Eliot there. In our end is our beginning. But the mayor of Casterbridge, he is as trapped as those songbirds in his fate throughout the book as he can possibly be.
Yes.
And when he does at the end die and his life is being spoken about and people are trying to forgive him, you get the sense that there was no other way, that had he lived, the book would not have worked.
Yeah. Interesting. What are you taking from that, conclusion wise? Is there anything in your own life that you take from it? Or is it simply a work of literature?
I think that when you're talking about Hardy, you're hoping that your life is not going to batter you around quite so badly as he does to his characters. And I think also I'm not a great believer in fate. At the end of the day, I think that we make our own fate in real life. But of course, I'm not a character in a book. At least, well, I actually am a character in my book. But I'm also the author of that book, so I at least can have some control over what. And I do get stabbed fairly regularly these are in the Hawthorne novels. But I am sort of in charge of it. But I think one thing you said, which I think is interesting to pick up on, is the idea of books at school to some extent ruining your pleasure. I remember the same thing happened with Dickens, where we were given hard times. We were Jude the Obscure when I was at school, and I came to Mayor of Casterbridge untainted, if you like.
Well done.
And you say that, but it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I do think that it is great that schools, or used to, introduce young people to the great works of literature. But there was always that terrible danger that exercise, that initiation, would actually put kids off books for life. Hard Times made me hate Dickens. I mean, but it is also his most sort of grimmest and least enjoyable book. Why that one? And it was years later that somebody strong-armed me into reading Great Expectations and began that particular love of reading. So it is true, of course, that Hardy was very much the author of choice, along with Austen and various other 19th century writers, when I was at my secondary school, what would that be, sort of back in the sort of 60s, 70s or whatever. And you are right, but there is a danger in the love of the book being ruined by the very simple, academic rigor of it. I read English literature at university as well, and the same was true there, though, that I didn't much like reading books because I had to. But at the same time, if you don't discuss great literature and at least raise young people's awareness of it to an extent, will they find it?
And that's why it's so important to get a good teacher. And a good teacher with a classic book, as I had eventually with Animal Farm and Mr. Clark. And suddenly this book that could have made me fall asleep turned out to be one of my all-time favorites because he taught it and he brought it to life. It was like Dead Poets Society. It was just one of those great teachers.
Well, intentionally or not, Ryan, you are seeing brilliantly into my third choice, and it's all about the fact, and I totally agree with you, that I have talked about my school and the hideous teachers, but I'm very, very well aware of how marvelous teachers are, how wonderful and how influential and how important they are, and how to an extent underappreciated so many of them are these days, and how I was so lucky to have my three teachers at my secondary school. And just like you, whether you can rattle off a title and the name of the teacher, I could say Mr. Alden, Mr. Helliwell and Mr. Brown.
Isn't it funny?
Language and literature and drama, and they were the making of me.
Well, let us tiptoe neatly to our third and final selection, your third and final selection today, Anthony Horowitz, which is, of course, the book that changed your life. And again, it's a broad title for a book choice. Was this a tough one for you, or did you jump immediately to the bookshelf and say it's that one?
But it is interesting. I mean, all books, to a certain extent, all great books change your life, if only a little bit. I mean, I remember reading Dr. No, Ian Fleming, and that had a huge impact on my life. I very nearly, for this particular segment of your podcast, brought in a Sherlock Holmes book because I became a crime writer because of Conan Doyle. And yet the book I chose was important to me and changed my life in a very literary way. And it comes back to one of those three teachers I mentioned to you, a man called Geoffrey Helliwell, who was my English literature teacher, who I remember one summer holiday, at the beginning of a summer holiday, the end of that term, he said I should try and enter a prize, which is you had to write an essay, and if you won it, you got given a book token. And the book, which was the compulsory book, was my third choice, which is The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, a book written in the 1950s, and I'll come to the plot in a minute.
Yes.
But this book was not like any book I'd ever read before, because yes, I was being given books in class to read, but this was the summer holidays, don't forget, and I was reading it on my own, not with other kids, around me, and not with a teacher reporting, having to report to a teacher every week about how far I'd got. I literally just had to sit down and read this book. And what it did was, my pleasure reading at that time was very, very light. It was Alistair MacLean, it was Desmond Bagley, it was Leslie Charteris, it was, Agatha Christie probably. And it was what you might call very light fiction. And this book, The Go-Between, is not a great classic, although it does have the greatest opening line of probably any book ever written. And I'm sure people listening to this will know the line when I quote it, hopefully correctly, which is, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." What a wonderful line. I wish I could come up with an opening like that. And what this book did, as I read it by myself at home in the holidays, was it opened my eyes to the power of great literature. That, as simple as that a book could be more than people chasing each other with guns, and it could be more than who killed who killed the Dowager Duchess. It was obviously the butler. This book is a love story, and at that age, I was I forget how old I was then. I suppose I must have been about 17.
Yes.
I was still in an all-boy environment, so I hadn't yet found sort of romance of any sort in my life, and it opened my eyes to that too, because it is a terribly sad love story. And I'm talking about sad, books that make you cry. This one could almost have entered that category too, because it is just a terribly sad story. In a nutshell, it's about a boy called Leo, who comes from a sort of a middle-class family, but is at school with a much richer boy called Miles, who invites him home for the summer. And Miles, as soon as Leo arrives, Miles falls ill, and Leo is dragged into a secret affair between Ted Burgess, who is the groundsman and the sort of gardener, and the daughter of the family, the older daughter of the family. And he becomes a go-between, carrying messages from one to the other without being aware. But of course, at that time, the affair would have been a huge scandal and would have resulted in, goodness knows what, but it would have, done terrible things to both parties. And so it's very, very secretive. And to him, it's a sort of an adventure, and he gets drawn in further and further. And I think what is really interesting about the book is that Leo is utterly corrupted by the experience and is destroyed by it, and ends up as this very dry, sad, lonely, middle-aged man telling the story. So it is an incredibly potent and powerful story. And I have to mention, because I know it is a book podcast, but it was also turned into the most wonderful film. Directed by Joseph Losey, and written, and this is the important thing, so it brings us back to literary greats, written by no less than Harold Pinter. Harold Pinter wrote a screenplay like none I have ever read. I have read it as well as seen it, and it had an absolutely astounding cast with Julie Christie and Alan Howard. Is it not Alan Howard? Alan Bates as the two lovers. But it had a wonderful cast as well. Michael Gough was in there, and it's a brilliant film with a very, very fine music score as well by Michel Legrand.
Oh, quite! It covers everything, and this is undiscovered territory to me. Sadly, although I did recognize the opening quote. All right. This is the first book in the series that has been chosen by one other person along the way.
Sorry, you've already had this book.
We've had this book once before. And I'm really happy about that, because the person before has very different reasons for picking it.
But did they choose it also as their transition book? Because that's the point I want to come to. The reason I've chosen it is because I think it's really interesting. Young people are encouraged to read the whole time. Everyone bangs on about getting young people to read, libraries and schools. I am guilty of this, I'm afraid. But nobody ever thinks what next. Nobody ever thinks of reading and the importance of reading being a journey. But you start in the foothills and you climb into the mountains, and you can start with books that are very light, Tintin, and through reading you can reach to Dickens, Dostoevsky, to Trollope, to the great masters of book, to Booker Prize winners, and to sort of, to the greats of literature. And that's a journey that one should, if one can, make. And I think that why I love this book, The Go-Between, is I think it's a bridge from those early sort of light books and sort of the books of childhood.
Yes.
I think it's a wonderful way to explore the next level, if you like, of literature with an L that is in danger of becoming capitalized.
And remind us of the life-changing element of this book for you. Just give us a kind of crystallized
I think it was an awareness of the sadness of life, but not my sadness, about how sad life can be for no good reason. That life is a challenge, and that when I was feeling sad myself, I think, well, look what happened to Leo, and it wasn't his fault any more than it was the fault of the mayor of Casterbridge or anybody else.
It's chiming.
I did mention that earlier on, but there was a connection between the two books.
It's a connection.
They are both, in a sense, to a certain extent, about unhappiness.
Yes,
and
almost preordained or at least cosmic unpleasantness in life.
Yeah, nobody means to be unpleasant. These two characters, Ted and Marianne, they're selfish and they're self-obsessed, but they're not willfully cruel. They have this boy, Leo, and they make it into adventure. They are quite nasty to him. She, at the end of the book, becomes quite hard with him. When he realizes he's in too deep and he tries to get out of it, she says, no, you must keep helping us because our love depends on you, and such, and he's drawn into it. And the book has an absolutely shocking climax in a way. Not written in a way that is horrific, but nonetheless, at the end of the book, in a storm, he's dragged into the garden to go and find Marion because she's disappeared by her mother, who is furious. And what he sees is something that a boy should never see. And it sort of is the moment where his life is completely ruined. And
I'm totally swept up in this book now. I need to read it.
I think it, what is interesting is you told me to bring my books into this session, into this podcast. And I unfortunately, I couldn't find my own copy. And you went out and kindly found it for me in a shop. And I'm delighted to see that it is still an evergreen. There are so many books written. And this one, Hartley himself is not considered in the top rank of writers. You'd be hard-pressed, I think, to name any other books by him. I think I've read one other, which I didn't even terribly like. Yes. This is his masterpiece. So he doesn't join the sort of the canon of, Dickens or Thackeray that you will definitely find. But this book is still there in the shops, and anybody listening to this can get it quite easily. And I recommend it. I hope I haven't given too much away. But even so, it's not really about what happens. It's about the writing and the language and again the film, which you can probably get on DVD or something, is a fantastic companion to it.
I'm ready for it. It's so good. And I might even return to Casterbridge and say, it's time. I'm old enough now to have expunged the memory of school.
Well, Ryan, it is a question that faces us all, which is that as your years begin to diminish, you are, of course, a great deal younger than I am, but as your years begin to shrink and your horizons are getting a little shorter, you have to choose which of the books you loved when you were young you're going to go back and read one last time.
Yeah.
And I look at my own library in my house and I sometimes think, gosh, I really, I've never read War and Peace. Are you really going to finish your life and not have read War and Peace? Yeah. Well, then again, though, I have loved to read Great Expectations, maybe just one more time. I don't know. It's a terrible choice to have to make.
It's a morbid choice, but it's a fun choice. It's always fun.
It's always fun. That's true.
The final question we ask, and today I'll ask you, Anthony, is for the name of the autobiography you haven't written yet. I suppose before we get to the title, where are you on this idea of writing an autobiography and being asked to, and your willingness or otherwise?
I won't write an autobiography. That I can tell you for nothing, because there's not much to write about. I sat in a room, I wrote books, the end. But I did, funnily enough, once have an idea of writing a sort of autobiography. And I even had a title for it, so your question was an easy one. And this came about because I absolutely loved a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade by William Goldman. I also like very much On Writing by Stephen King.
Yes.
And these are two masterpieces about the art of writing and the sort of the skills that go into it. And I thought, well, one thing I do know what to do is to write. And I thought it might be quite interesting. And I've written pretty much, as you said in your kind introduction, pretty much everything. I've written, plays and books and TV and films, all the rest of it. So I thought, why didn't I write a sort of a memoir about my life as a writer with sort of life lessons for other writers who follow?
I'd love that.
And I wrote one chapter of this book before I was bored out of my skull, and I felt this is so egotistical and conceited. You know nothing. Incidentally, that's something William Goldman said. No one knows anything.
I love that quote.
So he both inspired me to write this book and to stop writing it. Yeah. And in fact, what I wrote in the end was Magpie Murders, which is a story of a writer and contains, as it were, some information about what it's like to be a writer, but is not, thank goodness, about me. So the title of the book that I was going to write, which was sort of an autobiography, was going to be 10 million words. And that is how many words I estimate I have written in my last sort of 40-50 years. When you think about each book, 100,000 words, 3 or 4 drafts for each book, 50 or something, maybe nearly 60 books now, plus television, films, all the rest of it, and then also schoolwork and letters and all the rest of it. I think I've probably made about 10 million words. That's quite a good title.
How does that feel?
I like the title. I'm not sure I like the idea. Yeah. I sometimes sit at my desk and I feel that there's a lorry that has backed into the room behind me, and it's gone up on its hydraulics, and these words are just tumbling endlessly over my shoulder onto the desk. How many more bloody words can there be? But they still keep coming. It's
funny because in the Hawthorne series that I love so much, you're Tony, which always makes me laugh when Hawthorne calls you Tony, and it's Anthony. No one calls me Tony, and there's I think there's kind of cheeky autobiography in there somewhere. There's shades of possibly your real life. Anyway, there's a mischievous version of you and your life in there somewhere.
I think, everything in the Hawthorne books is sort of true, but it's all about writing. And that's the point I think we're making here, is that I won't write an autobiography about my marriage, my 2 children, my holidays in Spain, because, it's just not something I'm interested in doing. Fiction is much, much more fun.
Yeah. I've loved talking to you. I think it's such an interesting insight into you, who who writes these books that give people like me and millions around the world such joy. And the books you've chosen have been, with the exception of Tintin, which is this amazing escape for a young lad, the other two have a sort of a melancholy and a depth to them that I wasn't expecting in some ways. Not that I think you're superficial, but I just wasn't. I didn't expect you to go there. They're both quite similar in the narrative of the great story of life, but they don't reflect, I think, the mischievous person that you are in reality.
Well, I'm happy to have surprised you, because I think that's one of the things I keep trying to do in my writing, is to sort of not be too predictable and to do things differently and to change. Well, you know, I have known you for many, many years, Ryan. I've always loved talking to you.
Same.
And I can't think of anything better that you could have said to me, but I've actually come here and talked to you today and told you perhaps something you didn't know.
Oh, I loved it. I always love talking to you. I love what you do for books, for words, all 10 million of them. And to have you as part of our podcast series has been an absolute delight. Anthony Horowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So here's this week's Ryan Recommends, brought to you by Eason, Ireland's favourite bookseller. Tana French, it's The Hunter. Tana French is one of the great Irish crime writers of our generation, and this book does not disappoint. It's Chicago meets the west of Ireland. There's homecoming, there's betrayal, there's revenge. What more do you want? It is a classic crime with a modern twist, and of course the fact that it's set in Ireland, Tana French captures Ireland so well in her books. This is another one from her canon. You're going to love it. It's going to be one of those ones that you're going to want to read on the bus, on the train, or on the plane. It's perfect companion because you just won't want to put it down. Tana French, The Hunter, go for it. This book and all the books we discuss on this episode of our podcast are available now in your local Eason store, or order them online from easons.com before 6 p.m. for same-day dispatch with free delivery when you spend over a tenner. Eason, be inspired.